A child's silent battle. The courtroom was filled with a heavy silence, the kind that wrapped around the air and made it hard to breathe. Rows of wooden benches stretched out on either side of the room, occupied by curious onlookers, a few reporters, and the scattered family members who dared to show up. The fluorescent lights above hummed faintly, casting a stark glow over the polished wood panels, giving the entire scene an almost surreal edge. At the center of this legal battleground sat a boy, no older than 6, his small frame dwarfed by the bench on which he perched. His dark, curly hair was slightly messy, as though someone had hastily tried to brush it, but hadn't managed to tame it completely. His legs dangled off the edge of the seat, too short to reach the floor, and he swung them nervously, his sneakers lightly tapping the polished wood. His face was a mix of innocence and worry, his big brown eyes darting from one unfamiliar face to another, searching for something familiar, something safe. To his right sat his mother, a woman in her early 30s with a sharp, tense expression that she tried to mask with a forced calm. She wore a navy blazer that was slightly too big, as though borrowed for the occasion, and her makeup was applied with the precision of someone desperate to appear composed. In her trembling hand, she clutched a tissue, which she occasionally raised to her face to dab at invisible tears. Her lawyer sat beside her, whispering words of encouragement that seemed to do little to ease her visible discomfort. Across the room sat a man who, by all outward appearances, looked the picture of stability and control. He wore a perfectly tailored gray suit, his graying hair slicked back neatly, and his posture was rigid, almost unnaturally so. But if one looked closer, they would see the tension in his clenched jaw, and the way his hands gripped the edges of the table in front of him. This man was the boy's father, fighting to prove that he deserved to be a part of his son's life. His lawyer, a younger man with an air of confidence, sat next to him, occasionally leaning over to whisper advice or share a document. At the head of the room sat the judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp, discerning eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her expression was unreadable, her years of experience etched into the lines on her face. She adjusted her glasses and surveyed the room, her gaze lingering briefly on the boy before turning to the mother's lawyer. "You may proceed," the judge said, her voice calm and authoritative. The mother's lawyer stood, smoothing down his suit jacket as he approached the front of the courtroom. He was a tall man with an air of practiced confidence, his every movement deliberate. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "my client, Miss Lydia Carter, has been the primary caregiver for her son, Nathan, since the day he was born. She has dedicated her life to his well-being, often at great personal sacrifice." Lydia straightened in her seat, her grip on the tissue tightening. She glanced down at Nathan, who was staring at the floor, his small hands resting on his lap. Her eyes softened for a moment before returning to the lawyer, as though drawing strength from his words. "She has ensured that Nathan has everything he needs to thrive," the lawyer continued. "She has been there for every milestone, every scraped knee, every bedtime story. She has provided not only stability, but also a nurturing environment where Nathan can grow and flourish." The lawyer paused, letting his words hang in the air. The judge nodded slightly, signaling for him to continue. "My client acknowledges that the boy's father, Mr. Robert Walker, loves his son," the lawyer said, his tone shifting slightly. "But love, Your Honor, is not enough. Mr. Walker has been absent for much of Nathan's life. He has missed birthdays, school events, and important milestones. A parent cannot choose when to be present. A child needs consistency, reliability, and someone who will always put their needs first." As the lawyer spoke, Robert shifted in his seat. His face remained composed, but the slight tightening of his jaw betrayed his growing frustration. He glanced at Nathan, who had now stopped swinging his legs and was staring intently at the polished wood floor. There was a tension in the boy's small frame, a stiffness that seemed out of place for someone so young. The mother's lawyer stepped back toward Lydia, gesturing toward her as he continued. "Miss Carter has sacrificed everything for her son. She has put her career on hold, given up personal opportunities, all to ensure that Nathan feels safe and loved. She is not perfect, Your Honor, but she is dedicated. And that is what this boy needs. Lydia dabbed at her eyes with the tissue, her voice trembling slightly as she leaned into the microphone. Your Honor, Nathan is my whole world. Everything I do is for him. I want to protect him, to give him the best life possible. The judge nodded again, her expression thoughtful as she made notes on the pad in front of her. The room was silent except for the faint scratching of her pen and the occasional creak of the wooden benches as people shifted in their seats. Thank you, Miss Carter, the judge said finally, her voice steady. She turned to Robert's lawyer. Mr. Lawrence, you may proceed. Robert's lawyer stood, adjusting his tie as he made his way to the center of the courtroom. His demeanor was calm but assertive, his eyes sharp as he surveyed the room. Your Honor, he began, while we acknowledge the dedication and sacrifices Miss Carter has made, we must also consider the full picture. Mr. Walker has made every effort to be a part of his son's life. Despite the challenges and obstacles placed in his path, he has remained steadfast in his commitment to Nathan. Nathan glanced up briefly at the sound of his father's name, his big brown eyes flicking toward the man who sat across the room. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, hope, perhaps, or maybe just confusion. Robert's lawyer continued, his tone measured. My client has consistently attempted to maintain a relationship with his son. He has sent letters, made phone calls, and even shown up to events, only to be turned away or ignored. This is not a case of neglect, Your Honor. This is a case of parental alienation. The words hung in the air, heavy and charged. Lydia stiffened in her seat, her expression tightening. She opened her mouth to protest, but her lawyer placed a hand on her arm, silently urging her to remain composed. The judge scribbled another note before looking up at Nathan. Nathan, she said gently, her tone softening, would you like to say anything? This is a safe space, and your voice matters here. The room fell into an almost suffocating silence as all eyes turned to the little boy. For a moment, it seemed as though he wouldn't speak, his lips pressed tightly together and his hands gripping the edge of the bench. But then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said the words that would change everything. Mommy's lying. The courtroom froze. Heads turned sharply toward Nathan, shock and disbelief etched into every face. Lydia's expression shattered, her carefully constructed facade crumbling as she stared at her son. Even the judge looked momentarily taken aback, her pen pausing midair. What did you say, Nathan? The judge asked gently, leaning forward slightly. Nathan swallowed hard, his small voice trembling as he repeated, Mommy's lying. In that moment, the carefully crafted narratives of both sides began to unravel, leaving everyone in the room grappling with the unfiltered truth of a child's courage. The weight of the truth. The courtroom was steeped in a tense, almost suffocating silence after Nathan's bold declaration. Mommy's lying, the boy had said, his small voice trembling but unwavering. His words hung in the air like a thunderclap, sending ripples of shock through everyone present. Lydia froze in her seat, her carefully composed exterior crumbling in an instant. Her hands trembled as she clutched the tissue, now damp from her nervous grip. She turned to Nathan, her face a mix of panic and disbelief, but the boy wouldn't meet her gaze. Across the room, Robert sat motionless, his usually composed face betraying a flicker of astonishment and concern. The judge, a seasoned veteran of countless custody battles, leaned forward slightly. Her sharp eyes softened just enough to convey reassurance as she addressed Nathan directly. Nathan, she said gently, her tone encouraging but firm, can you explain what you mean? This is a safe place, and we're here to listen. Nathan fidgeted with the hem of his sweater, his small fingers twisting the fabric into knots. For a moment, he seemed too afraid to speak again. But then, as though gathering all the courage he could muster, he took a shaky breath and raised his eyes to the judge. Mommy says everything is for me, he began, his voice soft and hesitant. "But it's not true." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by an uneasy shuffle of feet and murmurs from the spectators. Lydia's face turned pale as she tried to maintain her composure, her lips parting as though to interrupt, but no words came. The judge raised a hand to silence the murmurs, her gaze never leaving Nathan. "Go on," she encouraged. "Take your time." Nathan glanced briefly at his mother, his expression filled with both guilt and determination. "She says Daddy doesn't love me," he continued, his voice cracking slightly. "She tells me he's bad, and that he doesn't care about me, but that's not true." The courtroom was stunned into silence once more. Even the stenographer, who had been diligently typing away, paused for a fraction of a second. Robert's lawyer leaned forward, his pen poised over a notepad, while Lydia's lawyer fidgeted nervously, clearly unprepared for this turn of events. Nathan's small shoulders rose and fell as he took another deep breath. "Daddy tries to call me," he said, his voice gaining a hint of strength. "He sends me letters and pictures, but Mommy hides them. She tells me I can't talk to him because he doesn't want to talk to me." Robert shifted in his seat, his hands gripping the edge of the table. His jaw tightened as he fought to keep his emotions in check. Lydia, on the other hand, looked like she was on the verge of breaking down completely. Her carefully painted mask of confidence had shattered, leaving behind a woman visibly unraveling under the weight of her son's words. "Nathan," the judge said, her voice steady but kind, "how do you feel about your father? Do you want to see him?" Nathan nodded slowly, his big brown eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I miss him," he admitted, his voice trembling. "I just want to see him. I don't like when Mommy says bad things about him. It makes me feel sad." Lydia's lawyer finally found his voice, standing abruptly. "Your Honor," he began, his tone strained, "this is highly irregular, the testimony of a 6-year-old. The judge silenced him with a sharp glance. "Sit down, counselor," she said curtly. "This court will hear the child out." Nathan's tiny hands fidgeted in his lap as he hesitated, clearly wrestling with his emotions. Then, with another deep breath, he spoke again. "Mommy told me to say bad things about Daddy," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said if I didn't, I might not get to stay with her." The room erupted into shocked whispers, the sound reverberating off the courtroom walls. The judge banged her gavel sharply, demanding order. "Quiet," she commanded, her tone brooking no argument. The murmurs subsided, leaving only the echo of the gavel and the soft sniffles of the boy on the stand. Lydia's face turned crimson, her hands shaking as she clutched the tissue. "Nathan," she said, her voice low and strained, "why would you say that? You know I love you. Everything I've done is for you." Nathan looked up at her, his innocent eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and confusion. "I know you love me," he said softly, "but I love Daddy too." The simplicity of his statement struck like a blow, and for a moment, Lydia seemed completely deflated. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Across the room, Robert lowered his head into his hands, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on his shoulders. The judge cleared her throat, drawing everyone's attention back to her. "Nathan," she said gently, "you've been very brave today. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us? Anything at all?" Nathan hesitated, his fingers tightening their grip on the edge of the bench. "I just want Mommy and Daddy to stop fighting," he said finally, his voice quivering. "I want them to stop being mad at each other. I just want us to be happy." The courtroom fell into an almost reverent silence, the weight of the boy's words sinking in. For all the legal arguments, the accusations, and the posturing, it was the raw, unfiltered truth of a child's pain and longing that cut through it all. The judge leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes scanning the room. "This court takes the well-being of children very seriously," she said, her voice firm. "What we've heard today raises significant concerns about the environment in which this child has been placed. I am ordering an immediate review of all communication and interactions between both parents." Lydia's lawyer stood again, his face pale. "Your Honor," he began, his voice trembling. "Surely we can." "No, Counselor," the judge interrupted, her tone icy. "This is not up for debate. The truth of this situation will come to light, and this court will ensure that this child's best interests are prioritized." The courtroom buzzed with hushed murmurs as the judge banged her gavel, signaling a temporary recess. As people began to file out, Lydia turned to Nathan, her face a mask of desperation. "Honey," she said, her voice shaking, "why would you say those things? Don't you know I'm trying to protect you?" Nathan didn't respond. He simply stared at his shoes, his small hands clutching the hem of his sweater. Across the room, Robert hesitated before stepping forward, his expression cautious but earnest. "I'm proud of you," he said softly, crouching down to Nathan's eye level. That took a lot of courage. Nathan looked up at him, his eyes brimming with tears. "I just want you and Mommy to stop fighting," he said, his voice barely audible. Robert's face twisted with emotion, but he nodded firmly. "I know, buddy," he said. "We'll figure it out. I promise." As the courtroom emptied, leaving behind only echoes of whispered conversations and shuffling feet, one thing was clear. The truth had finally emerged, and there was no turning back. The cracks began to show. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense as the recess drew to a close. The spectators filed back to their seats, their whispers subdued but charged with curiosity. For many of them, this was no longer just a legal battle. It was a deeply personal story that had unfolded before their eyes, one with stakes far greater than anyone had anticipated. Nathan sat quietly on the bench next to his mother, his small frame hunched forward as though the weight of his words had physically drained him. His legs no longer swung back and forth. Instead, they hung limply, the tips of his sneakers barely brushing the polished wood floor. His big brown eyes stared at the ground, unfocused and distant. The innocence in his gaze was overshadowed by the turmoil swirling within him. Lydia sat stiffly beside her son, her posture still attempting to project a sense of control that was rapidly slipping away. Her face, once carefully composed, now bore the signs of strain. Her makeup, expertly applied at the start of the day, had begun to smear slightly at the corners of her eyes. Her hands, still clutching the tissue, trembled visibly as she glanced around the room, avoiding the gazes that seemed to pierce through her. Robert, seated across the courtroom, looked equally shaken, though his demeanor was markedly different. His usually stoic face was softened by an expression of deep concern. His lawyer leaned in, whispering something into his ear, but Robert didn't seem to hear. His eyes were locked on Nathan, the boy who had just shattered months of legal arguments with a few simple, heartfelt words. The judge re-entered the room, her black robe flowing behind her as she took her seat at the bench. She adjusted her glasses and surveyed the room, her sharp gaze briefly lingering on Lydia, then Robert, and finally Nathan. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a gravity in her demeanor that demanded attention. "This court will now reconvene," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Before we proceed, I want to remind everyone present that this is a matter of the utmost seriousness. The statements made earlier by the child raise significant concerns, and it is our responsibility to address them thoroughly and fairly." She turned her attention to Nathan, her tone softening slightly. "Nathan, you've done very well so far. Thank you for being brave and honest with us. I want you to know that you're safe here. If you feel ready, I'd like to ask you a few more questions. Is that okay?" Nathan looked up at her, his small hands fidgeting in his lap. He nodded hesitantly, his voice barely audible as he replied, "Okay." The judge offered him a gentle smile before continuing. "You said earlier that your mommy told you not to talk to your daddy. Can you tell me more about that? What did she say?" Nathan hesitated, his eyes darting briefly to his mother, who sat frozen beside him. She said Daddy doesn't love me," he began, his voice trembling. "She said he's too busy to care about me, and that he only pretends to be nice." A gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by a flurry of whispers. The judge banged her gavel sharply, silencing the noise. "Order in the court," she commanded, her voice firm. Nathan continued, his words coming faster now as though a dam had burst. "But it's not true. Daddy calls me all the time. He sends me cards and pictures. I know he loves me." Robert exhaled sharply, his hand moving to cover his mouth as he fought to keep his emotions in check. Lydia, on the other hand, seemed to shrink into herself. Her face turned ashen, and her grip on the tissue tightened to the point that it began to tear. The judge leaned forward slightly, her gaze focused on Nathan. "Nathan, do you know why your mommy might say those things about your daddy?" Nathan hesitated, his small hands twisting together nervously. "She told me it's because Daddy hurt her feelings," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said he doesn't deserve to see me." The weight of the boy's words hit the room like a thunderclap. Lydia's lawyer stood abruptly, his face pale. "Your Honor, I must object to this line of questioning," he said, his voice strained. "This is putting undue pressure on a child." The judge's sharp gaze shifted to him. "Your objection is noted, Counselor, but this court has an obligation to uncover the truth," she said firmly. "Nathan's testimony is critical to understanding the dynamics at play in this case." Turning back to Nathan, the judge softened her tone again. "You're doing a wonderful job, Nathan. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about how things have been at home?" Nathan bit his lip, his eyes welling with tears. I just want them to stop fighting," he said finally, his voice cracking. "I want them to be happy. I want us to be happy." The simplicity of his wish, spoken with such raw emotion, brought the courtroom to a stunned silence. Even the judge seemed momentarily taken aback, her eyes narrowing slightly as she processed his words. "Thank you, Nathan," she said gently. "You've been very brave, and I'm proud of you." The judge turned her attention to the lawyers, her expression hardening. "This court needs to fully investigate the claims made here today. I am ordering a temporary review of all communication records between both parents, including phone calls, emails, and any documented interactions. Additionally, I am appointing a child psychologist to meet with Nathan and provide a professional evaluation." Lydia's lawyer opened his mouth to protest, but the judge silenced him with a pointed look. "This is not up for debate," she said coldly. "The welfare of this child is our top priority." Lydia looked as though the ground beneath her had given way. Her hands trembled violently as she clutched the remnants of her tissue, her eyes darting around the room as though searching for an escape. Robert, meanwhile, sat motionless, his hands clasped tightly together as he fought to maintain his composure. The judge's voice rang out again, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "We will adjourn for today to allow time for the evidence to be reviewed and for the psychological evaluation to take place. Both parties are expected to comply fully. This court is committed to ensuring that Nathan's best interests are upheld." As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the session, the tension in the room seemed to break like a dam. Spectators began to file out, their whispered conversations filling the air. Lawyers gathered their papers, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and resolve. Lydia turned to Nathan, her voice trembling. "Honey," she began, her words faltering. "You know I love you, right? I'm just trying to protect you." Nathan didn't respond. He simply looked at her with an expression that was far too old for a boy his age, an expression of quiet understanding and unspoken sadness. Robert approached cautiously, his movements slow and deliberate. He crouched down to Nathan's level, his voice soft but steady. "Nathan," he said, "you were very brave today. I'm so proud of you." Nathan looked up at his father, his big brown eyes glistening. "I just want us to be okay," he whispered. "I just want us to be happy." Robert nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. "We'll figure it out, buddy," he promised. "We'll make it better." As the courtroom emptied and the players in this deeply personal drama went their separate ways, one thing was certain. The cracks in the carefully constructed facades had been exposed, and there was no turning back. The truth, as painful and messy as it was, had begun to emerge, and it was up to everyone involved to decide what they would do with it. The storm before the calm. The day after the courtroom revelations was heavy with tension. Nathan woke up to the sound of his mother's muffled voice. Lydia was on the phone in the living room, her tone sharp and brittle, the words spilling out too quickly for Nathan to understand fully. He lay still in his bed, clutching his blanket tightly, the events of the previous day replaying in his mind like a broken record. "Mommy's lying." The words echoed in his head, bringing with them a confusing mix of relief and guilt. He had spoken the truth, but at what cost? Nathan didn't know if he had made things better or worse. He only knew that something had shifted, something that couldn't be undone. Downstairs, Lydia paced the living room, her phone pressed to her ear. She was dressed in a worn gray sweatshirt and yoga pants, her usually immaculate appearance abandoned. Her hair was pulled into a haphazard bun, and dark circles under her eyes betrayed a sleepless night. "I can't believe this is happening," she said into the phone, her voice low but frantic. "He's just a child. He doesn't understand what he's saying. He doesn't understand what this will do to us." Her lawyer's voice crackled on the other end, calm but firm. "Lydia, you need to remain composed. The judge will be reviewing the communication records, and the child psychologist will be meeting with Nathan soon. This isn't the time to panic." "Panic?" Lydia hissed, her voice rising slightly. "My own son just accused me of lying in court. Do you have any idea what that felt like? What this could mean for custody?" "Lydia," the lawyer replied, his tone steady, "this is not the end. The judge hasn't made a final decision yet. What's important now is that you focus on cooperating with the court's orders and ensuring Nathan feels supported." Lydia exhaled sharply, her hand tightening around her phone. She glanced toward the staircase, where she could faintly hear the sound of Nathan moving around in his room. Her chest tightened with a mix of anger and despair. How could he betray her like that, after everything she'd done for him? But beneath the anger was a nagging whisper of doubt, a voice she didn't want to acknowledge. Had she gone too far? Had her desire to protect Nathan from Robert blinded her to the harm she was causing? Nathan crept down the stairs, his small frame hesitant and quiet. He peeked around the corner into the living room, his big brown eyes watching his mother carefully. When Lydia noticed him, she ended the call abruptly, slipping her phone into her pocket. "Morning, sweetheart," she said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Did you sleep well?" Nathan shrugged, his gaze dropping to the floor. He shuffled into the kitchen and climbed onto a chair at the table. Lydia followed him, her movements slow and deliberate as she poured him a bowl of cereal. She set it in front of him, the sound of the spoon clinking against the bowl loud in the otherwise quiet kitchen. "Nathan," she said after a moment, her voice soft but strained, "what you said yesterday, in court, why did you say that?" Nathan froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. He didn't look up. "Because it's true," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Lydia's forced smile faltered. She sank into the chair across from him, her hands clasped tightly together on the table. "Sweetheart, you know I only want what's best for you, right? Everything I do because I love you." Nathan finally looked up, his innocent eyes filled with a sadness that seemed far too heavy for someone his age. "I know, Mommy," he said quietly, "but I love Daddy too." The words hit Lydia like a punch to the gut. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time, she felt the full weight of her actions, not just the lies, but the way they had shaped her son's view of the world. The realization was like a crack forming in the foundation of a house, small but impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Robert sat in his small, sparsely furnished apartment, staring at the pile of letters and photographs spread across the coffee table. Each one was a piece of evidence he had provided to the court, proof of his attempts to stay connected with Nathan. The letters were neatly written, filled with words of love and encouragement. The photographs showed moments he had tried to capture despite the distance, Birthday presents he'd sent, school events he'd attended from the sidelines, moments of fatherly pride that had gone unacknowledged. His lawyer, Daniel Lawrence, sat across from him, flipping through the documents with a practiced eye. "These will go a long way in proving your case," Daniel said, his tone professional but sympathetic. But the real turning point was Nathan's testimony. That was powerful. Robert leaned back on the couch, running a hand through his graying hair. "I just want him to know how much I love him," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't care about winning or losing. I just want to be in his life." Daniel nodded, his expression softening. "And you will be. The truth is on your side, but it's important to stay calm and follow the court's orders. The psychological evaluation will play a big role in the judge's decision." Robert sighed, his eyes drifting to a framed photo on the wall. It was from years ago, back when he and Lydia had been happy, back when they had been a family. The image of Nathan as a toddler, giggling in his father's arms, tugged at his heart. How had it all gone so wrong? The days leading up to the psychological evaluation were a whirlwind of emotions. Lydia tried to regain control, carefully monitoring her interactions with Nathan and ensuring every moment they spent together painted her in the best possible light. She read him bedtime stories, helped him with his schoolwork, and even baked cookies with him. Things she hadn't done in months. But no matter how hard she tried, there was an unspoken tension between them, a rift that no amount of forced smiles or gestures could bridge. Nathan's eyes held a cautiousness that hadn't been there before, as though he was constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. Robert, on the other hand, approached the situation with a quiet determination. He called Nathan every evening, his voice steady and reassuring, as he asked about his day, and reminded him how much he was loved. Though their conversations were brief, they were filled with a warmth that Nathan clung to like a lifeline. When the day of the evaluation finally arrived, both Lydia and Robert found themselves sitting in the waiting room of a child psychologist's office. The room was painted in soft, calming colors, and shelves lined with toys and books gave it an inviting feel. But the atmosphere between the two parents was anything but calm. Lydia sat rigidly in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Robert sat a few seats away, his posture more relaxed, but his expression no less tense. Neither spoke, their silence heavy with unresolved tension. Nathan sat between them, his small hands gripping the edge of his chair. His eyes darted nervously between his parents, his little face etched with worry. He didn't understand all the details of what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain. The adults in his life were at war, and he was caught in the middle. The door to the psychologist's office opened, and a warm, friendly woman stepped out. She smiled at Nathan, her kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "Hi, Nathan," she said gently. "Are you ready to come in and talk with me?" Nathan glanced at his parents, his big brown eyes wide and uncertain. Lydia smiled encouragingly, though the strain in her expression was clear. Robert gave him a small nod, his eyes filled with quiet reassurance. Taking a deep breath, Nathan stood up and followed the psychologist into her office. As the door closed behind them, Lydia and Robert exchanged a brief glance, a moment of shared vulnerability in the midst of their conflict. For the first time, they both felt the weight of what was truly at stake, not a legal victory, but the well-being of the little boy they both loved more than anything in the world. The battle within. The psychologist's office was a cozy contrast to the cold sterility of the courtroom. Soft sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow on the room's pastel walls. Shelves filled with books, colorful toys, and puzzles lined the corners, and a beanbag sat in the middle of a plush rug, inviting and non-threatening. It was a place designed to make children feel safe, to encourage them to speak freely. Nathan perched on the edge of the beanbag, his small hands gripping his knees tightly. He glanced around the room, taking in the unfamiliar sights, his big brown eyes flicking nervously toward the psychologist. Her name was Dr. Harper, and she radiated a calm, approachable energy that eased some of Nathan's initial apprehension. She was dressed casually in a sweater and slacks, her auburn hair tied back in a loose ponytail, and her gentle smile seemed genuine. "Nathan," Dr. Harper began, sitting cross-legged on the rug across from him. Her voice was warm and soothing. "Thank you for coming in to talk with me today. I know this might feel a little strange, but I promise we're just going to have a conversation. There's no right or wrong answers, just whatever you feel." Nathan nodded hesitantly, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "Okay," he mumbled. Dr. Harper smiled again and gestured toward a small table nearby, where crayons and paper were laid out. "Before we start, would you like to draw something? Sometimes it's easier to talk when we're doing something with our hands." Nathan glanced at the crayons, his fingers itching to grab them. He nodded again, this time with a little more enthusiasm. Dr. Harper rose and brought the materials to him, setting them on the floor between them. Nathan chose a blue crayon and began to draw slow, careful lines on the paper. "Do you like to draw?" Dr. Harper asked casually, watching as Nathan started to sketch what looked like a house with a tree beside it. "Yeah," Nathan said quietly. "I draw a lot at home. Sometimes at school, too." "That's great," Dr. Harper said. "You're very good at it." She paused for a moment before continuing. "Can you tell me a little about your family, Nathan? What do you like to do with your mom and dad?" Nathan's crayon froze mid-stroke, and he looked up at her, his expression cautious. "Mommy takes care of me," he said slowly. "She makes my lunch and helps me with my homework. Sometimes we watch movies together." Dr. Harper nodded, her expression encouraging. "That sounds nice. And what about your dad?" Nathan hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the window. "I don't see Daddy a lot," he admitted. "But he calls me, and he sends me letters and pictures. He tells me he loves me." Dr. Harper leaned forward slightly, her tone gentle. "How does that make you feel, Nathan, when your dad calls you or sends you letters?" Nathan's eyes welled up with tears, but he blinked them away quickly. "I feel happy," he said, his voice trembling. But sometimes Mommy gets mad when I talk about Daddy. She says he doesn't care about me." Dr. Harper's expression softened, and she waited a moment before speaking again. "That sounds like a lot to handle, Nathan. It's okay to feel confused or upset about that. Can you tell me more about what happens when your mom says those things?" Nathan's hands clenched around the crayon, pressing hard enough to snap the tip. "She says Daddy isn't a good person," he whispered, "that he doesn't really love me. But I know he does." The raw emotion in Nathan's voice tugged at Dr. Harper's heart. She let him sit in silence for a moment, giving him space to process his feelings. When he finally looked back at her, his eyes were filled with a mix of hurt and resolve. "I just want them to stop fighting," Nathan said, his voice cracking. "I want them to stop being mad at each other." While Nathan poured his heart out to Dr. Harper, Lydia sat in the waiting room, her foot tapping anxiously against the tiled floor. She clutched her phone in one hand, her knuckles white, as she scrolled through emails and text messages she didn't truly read. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, looping endlessly back to the courtroom and Nathan's damning words. "Mommy's lying." She had replayed that moment in her head 100 times, each repetition chipping away at her confidence. She wanted to blame Robert, the lawyers, even the judge. But deep down, she knew the blame wasn't theirs to carry. It was her own actions, her own decisions, that had brought them to this point. Robert sat a few seats away, his hands resting on his knees as he stared at the door to Dr. Harper's office. He hadn't spoken to Lydia since they'd arrived, and the silence between them was heavy with unspoken words. He wanted to ask her why she had turned Nathan against him, why she couldn't see the damage it was causing. But he knew that this wasn't the time or place. Finally, Lydia broke the silence, her voice low and strained. "Do you think he's okay in there?" Robert glanced at her, surprised by the vulnerability in her tone. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Nathan's strong. Stronger than either of us give him credit for." Lydia nodded, her gaze dropping to her lap. "I didn't want it to be like this," she admitted, her voice trembling. I didn't want to lose him." "You were never going to lose him, Lydia," Robert said, his voice steady but firm. "He needs both of us. This fighting, the lies, it's hurting him more than either of us realizes." Lydia didn't respond, but her shoulders slumped as though the weight of his words had finally sunk in. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of shame, not just for what she had done, but for the pain she had caused her son. When Nathan emerged from Dr. Harper's office an hour later, his face was a mixture of exhaustion and relief. Dr. Harper followed him out, her expression calm but thoughtful. "He did very well," she said, addressing both parents. "Nathan's a bright, sensitive boy. He expressed himself clearly and honestly." Robert stood and crouched down to Nathan's level, offering him a warm smile. "You okay, buddy?" he asked gently. Nathan nodded, leaning into his father's outstretched arms for a brief hug. Lydia watched the interaction with a mix of emotions: jealousy, guilt, and a faint sense of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to make things right. Dr. Harper's next words brought them both back to reality. "I'll be submitting my report to the court," she said. "In the meantime, I encourage you both to consider how your actions impact Nathan. He loves you both very much, and he needs to see that love reflected in the way you treat each other." The weight of her statement hung in the air as Lydia and Robert exchanged a hesitant glance. For the first time, they both understood that this wasn't just about winning or losing custody. It was about rebuilding the trust they had broken, not with each other, but with the little boy who stood between them, holding out hope that they could stop the war for his sake. Steps toward healing. The courtroom buzzed with hushed anticipation as Lydia and Robert entered together for what could be the final hearing. The air felt different this time. Less charged, more subdued. The days since Nathan's psychological evaluation had been transformative, not just for the case, but for everyone involved. The weight of their choices, their battles, and their pain now sat heavier than ever on Lydia and Robert's shoulders. Lydia wore a muted gray dress, her makeup minimal, her face free of the steely determination she had once wielded like armor. She seemed smaller somehow, her posture softer, her expressions less guarded. Robert, dressed in a simple navy suit, mirrored the change. His rigid stance was gone, replaced by a quiet composure that spoke of resolve rather than triumph. Nathan wasn't in the courtroom this time. The judge had ruled that he didn't need to be present for the final decision. Both parents had agreed, not wanting to subject him to any more strain than he had already endured. For the first time in what felt like forever, they had found common ground. The judge entered, her presence commanding silence as everyone rose. She settled into her seat, her sharp eyes scanning the room before resting briefly on Lydia. Then Robert. Her expression was unreadable, but her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen it all. "This court has reviewed all evidence, including the communication records, the testimony provided by both parties, and the psychological evaluation of the child," she began. Her tone was firm but not unkind. "It is clear that this case is not just about custody, but about the well-being of a child caught in the crossfire of his parents' conflict." Lydia swallowed hard, her hands gripping the edge of the table in front of her. Robert sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the judge, his jaw tight. "The psychological evaluation revealed a boy who loves both of his parents deeply," the judge continued. "Nathan has expressed a desire to see his father and a longing for his parents to stop fighting." His words were both heartbreaking and illuminating. The judge paused, her eyes narrowing slightly as she leaned forward. "Miss Carter, the evidence shows a pattern of behavior that has caused undue strain on Nathan. The attempts to alienate him from his father are well documented and cannot be ignored." Lydia's face crumpled, tears pooling in her eyes as the judge's words hit her like a physical blow. She glanced at Robert, who remained stoic, though his hand trembled slightly where it rested on the table. However, the judge continued, her voice softening. "This court also recognizes that Miss Carter has been a dedicated mother who acted out of fear and a misguided sense of protection. While these actions were harmful, they were not born of malice but of pain. Lydia's tears spilled over, and she raised a trembling hand to wipe them away. The judge turned her gaze to Robert. "Mr. Walker, the evidence demonstrates your consistent efforts to be involved in your son's life, even in the face of significant obstacles. Your persistence speaks to your love and commitment as a father." Robert nodded slightly, his throat tightening as he fought back his own emotions. "This court's primary concern is Nathan's well-being," the judge said firmly. "To that end, I am ordering shared custody. Both parents will have equal time with Nathan, with detailed stipulations for co-parenting and communication. Furthermore, both parents are required to attend co-parenting counseling sessions to learn how to work together for the benefit of their child." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom, but the judge silenced them with a sharp glance. "This ruling is not a punishment but an opportunity," she said, her gaze shifting between Lydia and Robert. "An opportunity to rebuild trust, to prioritize Nathan's needs above your own, and to show him what it means to love without conditions." She banged her gavel, signaling the end of the hearing. The room erupted into quiet conversations as spectators began to leave, but Lydia and Robert remained seated, the weight of the judge's words sinking in. Outside the courthouse, Lydia and Robert stood awkwardly by the steps, the crisp autumn air swirling leaves around their feet. Nathan was with a court-appointed caregiver for the day, giving them a rare moment of quiet without their son's watchful eyes. Lydia broke the silence first, her voice soft and shaky. "I didn't realize how much I was hurting him," she admitted, her gaze fixed on the ground. "I thought I was protecting him, but I was just protecting myself." Robert nodded, his own voice strained with emotion. "I get it," he said. "I made mistakes too. I should have fought harder earlier. I should have tried to understand instead of just reacting." Lydia finally looked up at him, her eyes red but sincere. "I'm sorry, Robert. For everything. For keeping him from you. For letting my anger get in the way." Robert met her gaze, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm sorry, too. For not seeing how scared you were. For letting this turn into a war instead of a conversation." They stood there for a moment, the animosity that had defined their relationship for so long beginning to dissolve. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. "What do we do now?" Lydia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert smiled faintly, a flicker of hope lighting his expression. "We show Nathan that we're on the same team," he said. "We show him that we're his parents, first and always." Over the next few weeks, the changes were small but significant. Lydia and Robert attended their first co-parenting counseling session, where they sat in the same room for the first time without arguing. The counselor, a kind but firm woman named Janet, guided them through exercises that felt awkward at first, but slowly began to open the door to better communication. Nathan noticed the difference almost immediately. The tension that had once filled the air whenever his parents were in the same room was beginning to lift. They still weren't friends, but they spoke to each other with a new kind of respect, one that Nathan could feel. One crisp Saturday morning, Lydia and Robert stood side by side at Nathan's soccer game. Lydia held a thermos of coffee, and Robert carried a folding chair. They cheered for their son together, their voices blending in a way that felt, for the first time, like harmony. Nathan glanced at them from the field, his big brown eyes lighting up with a smile that could have warmed the entire stadium. For the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe. The journey wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, old wounds reopening at the wrong times. But each time, they reminded themselves of what was at stake. Nathan deserved a family, not a perfect one, but one that loved him enough to try. And so they tried, one day at a time, one step at a time. They built a fragile but growing peace, guided by the unwavering love of a little boy who had been brave enough to speak the truth. In the end, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about healing. And for Nathan, it was enough.